So what I'm saying is, if you deny one of those three beliefs above, you can solve the problem of evil, but the trick is, dare we deny any of those beliefs?
Welcome to Thinking About God with Dr. Barry Whitney. In this series, Dr. Whitney explores the formidable challenge of reconciling belief in God with the evil, injustice, and suffering in the world. What can be learned from theological study on this problem? What can be learned from faith? Separating good and bad answers by sound theological and biblical study and reflection has been central in Dr. Whitney's attempt to justify belief in God despite the world's evil and suffering. Now,
do you remember way back when there was a web document called Formulations of the Problem of Evil? Gives you the Freewill Defense. And that Freewill Defense is what Davis is talking about in Encountering Evil, Chapter 3. This is the logical problem of evil. Those three problems look like there's a logical contradiction. That belief in God is illogical, which is a polite word for irrational, meaningless. It's confused. It's logically inconsistent to believe in God because supposedly, if those three propositions are basic beliefs, they are logically inconsistent. Now, here's the trick. After about 50 years of being pounded by skeptics in this century, theologians, one of them, he's considered by some the leading theologian alive today, Alvin Plantinga. What he did was solve the logical problem of evil. After 40 or 50 years of theological, philosophical debate, when I was a student, I was subjected to the logical problem of evil and was told by my philosophy professor that this shows that belief in God is meaningless, irrational, a contradiction here. Plantinga solves it. There are two ways to solve it. You can deny one of the three beliefs. That would solve it. You now know that Roth denies number two. He doesn't believe that God is all-loving. That's an unbelievable thing for a theologian to say. What Griffin does is to look at the word omnipotence and say, I don't think that means that God determines everything, surely. Maybe God's power is the power of love, not the power of coercion. So he redefines the word omnipotence to solve the problem of evil. Hick makes it sound like every evil is simply God's way of building our soul. So he's really saying it's not evil, it's a means to a good end. So what I'm saying is, if you deny one of those three beliefs above, you can solve the problem of evil, but the trick is, dare we deny any of those beliefs? There's a way not to deny any of them that I want to show you. That's what Davis does. Now, here's the second way. So here's what Plantinga does. The way to show that, now this is how you think logically. This is what the logicians would say. You have to produce a fourth proposition to show that these three are a logical contradiction. You can't just sit back and say they're illogical. You have to show by means of a fourth proposition that everyone would agree is valid. You have to show it's a logical contradiction. And resolution 2 is what Davis does. God and Evil, Chapter 3. Davis says, I don't have to deny God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, or genuine evil exists. I can solve it by using Plantinga's way, Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. He's got to produce a fourth proposition that shows either, now what the atheists have to do, what the skeptics have to do, is they have to show that there's a fourth proposition that shows that there is a logical contradiction, and the theists have to show that there isn't a logical contradiction. This is all kind of described in Chapter 3 by Davis, but he's really using Plantinga. And if any of you find that you can't make head nor hair out of this stuff, William Rowe has a little book called Philosophy of Religion. He's one of the world's leading atheists. And this is like shocking stuff because in the 1990s, he said, lo and behold, the theists have shown that the logical problem of evil is not a problem. I agree. They're right. So what is it that we did to get this leading atheist to say that the logical problem of evil is not a problem? We showed with a fourth proposition that the three beliefs are not logically contradictory. If you're an atheist, you're a skeptic, what are you going to say about these three propositions? Just look at those again. How can you show What possible fourth proposition can you come up with to show that that's a contradiction? They've tried for 50 years. Here's what the atheists have said. Here's their fourth proposition. God, as omnipotent, would prevent all evil. If we all agreed that God, as omnipotent, would prevent all evil, then theists have a problem. But we don't all agree. There are lots of cases when God would allow evil for a good reason. Leibniz gave us an example. And the example is a general permits a few soldiers to die to save a town. So God had to permit some suffering and evil for a greater good. So the atheists, the skeptics, who are trying to show that belief in God is a logical contradiction with what we mean by God, they have a couple of leading candidates. This first one is easy to refute. The fourth proposition they say is, God would prevent all evil. And all a theist has to say is there are lots of examples in the world where people suffer. It doesn't work. Even we don't allow certain evils, like let a certain group die so that more people can live. There are reasons that isn't a universally accepted proposition. These propositions have to be true. There's another one that says God, as omnipotent, would prevent evils that are not logically necessary to bring about a greater good. That sounds better. That's a little bit better than the first one. God would take away. God's all-powerful, so God would prevent all evil. That one isn't a very good candidate. But the second one, God as all-powerful would prevent evils which are not logically necessary for a greater good. It's possible, but there are ways to refute that statement that God would prevent all evils that are not somehow necessary for the occurrence of some greater good. It doesn't really show there's a logical contradiction involved. It fails. The bottom line is there's a consensus, and when someone like William Rowe agrees that the atheists have not, or the skeptics have not given us this fourth proposition to show there's a logical contradiction, I think you can take it for granted that this thing is pretty much under control. But what have the theists done? It's one thing to say that no one can show that that's a logical contradiction, that belief in God because of suffering is meaningless, illogical. What we have to do as theists, and what we've done, what Plantinga did, he used a very simple statement. Here he shows that these three beliefs are not logically inconsistent. And what he did is he gave us what's called the Freewill Defense, but there's more to it than that. His fourth proposition is this. All you have to say is, God cannot make a good world in which there are free human creatures without evil. God's created the best world, a world in which there are free creatures. You can't have genuinely free creatures and always guarantee that they're going to use the freedom for good. Free means you have a choice between goods, a choice between good and evil, lesser goods, it's usually good and evil, but sometimes it's between two goods. Sometimes it's between two evils. But let's just say it's a choice. It's that simple. The logical problem of evil seems to be resolved by a simple free will defense. I can go through the whole ritual and give you all the logic, but it's that simple. To reconcile God's all-loving, God's all-powerful, evil exists. For me to prove that's not a contradiction is simply to say, and even the atheists agree, this is a possibly true statement. And if something is possibly true, it's not a logical contradiction. It can't be regarded as false. Whereas what the atheists say for their fourth proposition can be refuted easily, all of their examples. If I say God can't create free creatures, a blessing to have free creatures, a good, without having those creatures commit both goods and evils, that solves the logical problem of evil. Because that's very likely and very possible that's what happened. You're going to read in Davis's chapter 3 his version of, he's going to refer to Rowe and Plantinga, and he's going to say the logical problem of evil has been resolved. It's not an easy thing to read. When you start reading these philosophers, it's that simple though. There's three propositions, and all you need is a fourth sentence, a fourth proposition, the free will defense, to solve it, to show that there's no logical contradiction. In the other book by Nash, Worldviews in Conflict, he solves it even more simply. His fourth proposition is so innocent. He says, it's possible that God has a good reason for allowing evil. That's it. And an atheist, a skeptic can say, that's possible. You can't say it's not. It's ridiculous. Of course it's possible. That's all you have to say. Now, what this is a free will defense as opposed to a free will theodicy. This is defending belief in God against a serious 50-year challenge by atheists which say, as long as there's suffering and misery in the world, belief in God is irrational. It's a logical contradiction. All you have to say in response, and all we've said in response, Plantinga's free will defense is a difficult way to do it, but Nash simply says, it's possible that God has a good reason for allowing evil, and we would have to agree that fourth proposition is possibly true. And you can't say it's an illogical, meaningless sentence. So that's all we have to say. You can also say a couple of other things too, like you can give reasons for what God's possible reason is for allowing evil. It might be the free will defense. It might be, as one philosopher has argued, unless there are natural laws that cause us all kinds of natural disasters, misery, diseases, and sickness, we can't support human free will. There are lots of reasons we can suggest. So it's fair game to say the logical problem of evil can be solved with a simple statement, it's possible God has a reason. And the reason could be the free will defense. You don't even have to say what the reason is, but we will. It could be the free will defense. It could be natural evil. God creates a world with all this natural disaster, chaos, death, all of this, so that it's the appropriate world to support human beings. But all we have to do is say it's possible. Now, if you're wondering why the atheist Rowe is so happy to agree with this, the problem is he has another greater problem of evil that we haven't solved. And so Rowe in 1996, I believe it was, gave us this evidential problem. So here's the evidential problem of evil. Some evils lead to greater goods not otherwise attainable. That's number one. Remember now, everything we say in these propositions, 1, 2, 3, 4, have to be true. You can't stand up and say that's wrong. I don't agree with that. Most of us, all of us are supposed to agree that this is a true statement. Remember, when you're making an argument, your conclusion is meaningless unless these statements are true, and they have to lead to the conclusion. It's based on evidence rather than a logical contradiction. This may be why God allows them, okay, but there's evidence that some evils don't lead to greater goods not otherwise attainable. Horrendous evils, gratuitous evils. Some evils may lead to a greater good, so they're justified. Maybe that's why God allowed them. Some evils, though, seem to be completely meaningless, gratuitous, like a burning fawn or a murdered child. Just meaningless. There's no greater good. And that counts as evidence. And Rowe says it's strong evidence against God. Because it's not just one burning fawn, it's millions. And it's not just one murdered child, it's millions of them. This is strong evidence. This is sometimes called the emotional problem of evil, rather than the evidential. It's using evidence and it's saying, doesn't this count as strong emotional evidence against a loving and powerful God? See, they're not making the claim that it's irrational, it's illogical. They're appealing to the emotions now, to the evidence. God is all-powerful, could have prevented these burning fawns, these gratuitous evils, and because God hasn't done so, that counts as strong evidence. You could add the word strong against God. Nobody takes this thing as insignificant. The shock for me was reading Davis chapter 3 that I want you to look at next, right? And Davis says, after he shows you how the logical problem of evil can be solved, when he gets to the evidential one, he says, this doesn't bother me all that much, because God probably has a reason. It's called a skeptical defense. It's fair game. I mean, he may be right. Davis isn't impressed with the evidential problem of evil, but the atheists and the skeptics sure are. Now, here are some of the responses to the evidential problem of evil. I'm hoping if I give you this, because Davis doesn't talk about this, he doesn't find this a problem. Here's how you solve the evidential problem of evil. And I say solve in the sense that this isn't conclusive anymore. This is still a problem. There's some evils we could say, I can understand how God would allow them because look at the good, the greater good that's resulted. You know, there's something going on here in theology that it seems like the problem of evil solution focuses on two things, just so you know and you can watch for them. One is the free will defense, and the second one is the greater good argument. God wants or allows evils and suffering because they lead to a greater good, in general. Now, the evidential problem of evil challenges that. It says, yes, in most cases, it doesn't even say that, but I'm being generous. In many cases, you can see that suffering could be allowed by God because it leads to a greater good. But what about those instances of suffering where there is no greater good, like burning fawns, like murdered children? Well, there's two ways to answer this. And this is Davis's way, this first one. We don't know if there really are gratuitous, meaningless evils. Nobody knows that. I'll give you his whole answer. What seems to be meaningless, evils which don't lead to a greater good, not otherwise attained, they may be allowed for a good reason. Just because we don't know the reason doesn't mean that God doesn't have a good reason. That's one way to solve it. Davis simply says that and he's finished. He has nothing more to say about this, but I don't know if it's that simple. If it is, we're writing books for nothing, trying to solve this thing. I understand what he's saying, and I think that's the essence, but I think we just have to fill in some pieces here, because I'm sure if you're like any other class that's looked at this, there are a lot of questions that start popping up at this stage. So that's one way to do it. There's another way. I'll just give you all this so you can get my version of this if you want, and then Davis will make sense. He kind of drifts around this issue without ever answering it directly because he doesn't find it overwhelmingly problematic. Now, what's the other way to solve this thing? Well, you can argue that if there are gratuitous evils, and that means evils which don't lead to a greater good, even for God, there must be some other reason that God has allowed them, other than there being a greater good. We'll see when we get to chapter 2 that Hicks got an argument for gratuitous evils as important. If God didn't allow gratuitous evils, morality would be undercut. We have to do a lot of work on this one to see if we can solve it, because I think these are the emotional, evidential issues that we deal with. Most of us don't deal with the logical problem. We deal with the emotional problem. You get what the first one's saying? It's saying that from God's point of view, there's probably a reason, even if we don't understand it. This one is saying that it's not a greater good that God is allowing the evils for. It's some other reason. Hicks got, in chapter 2, a whole bunch of reasons why gratuitous evil, or how gratuitous evil can be understood. One of them is to say that if God didn't allow any meaningless evils, if every evil led to a greater good, that would eventually undercut morality. If we only get what we deserve, if we're good, we get good. If we're evil, we get evil. There's no gratuitous evil for good people. Morality wouldn't make any sense because we'd be conditioned to always do what's good to avoid the inevitable evil that's going to come. Long, hard story, but there are other reasons besides greater good that God may have in mind for allowing gratuitous evils. Think about like the burning fawn, think about a murdered child, and you start feeling the pressure of this evidential problem of evil. This is where it is now. This is the hard one. All the questions start arising, and all the emotions, the anger, the frustration, the lack of patience, the hope, the faith, all of that's here now. Now you're getting what's going on here. The evidential problem, just one last time, because then you can read this chapter with a little bit of, you'll see what's happening. It's not a logical contradiction, but it's an emotional thing. There seems to be evidence that evils are happening, some evils. We could add horrendous evils maybe to that, which is a new category, horrendous things, like just ghastly evils. If we could tell ourselves that there's a reason God allowed these because there's a greater good. Do you remember the Jews after the Holocaust, some of them saying the reason 6 million of us died was for the greater good of having a state of Israel? Or the reason God allowed all of this, not caused it, but allowed it, was for the greater good of giving us more social identity and showing the world how faithful some people can be. They had all of these greater goods. But there are some evils, say the gratuitous problem of evil, that don't seem to have any validation. There's no reason for God to allow them if there's no greater good. Now what this one is saying, that God may have other reasons than greater goods. Morality might be at stake. I particularly find that one odd, to say that every time God allows some case of suffering, it's for a greater good. why does it have to be a greater good? Like would be one of the questions. If you're asking why God doesn't intervene, you should be. If you can't think of a reason, see that's all you have to say as an answer. I can't think of a reason why God allows some of these so-called meaningless evils. I can't think of a reason, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. It just means that we are limited. That's a fair answer. Another question might be, I can't think of an answer. I can't even suggest why God would allow certain cases of suffering. Why a murdered child? Couldn't God intervene at least for that? Now, I hope you're starting to think that way. One of the big questions is, if God can intervene and prevent that sickness or this chaos or this suffering, why doesn't God intervene? That's a fair question. And you're going to see in chapter 2 that John Hicks says, my answer to that is, God never intervenes. Davis's answer in chapter 3 is, God seldom intervenes because of the integrity of the free will defense. If God intervenes too much, we're not really free. These are the philosophical answers that we're getting, and there are quite a few others. If God intervened, it would be like saying that God made a mistake, which is impossible, in creating the world this way, and then has to intervene ad hoc. I think these answers are tough ones. It's a fair question to say, like Roth does, is the free will defense worth it? Roth hates this defense because he says it's not cost effective. We have freedom, but it's not worth it unless God intervenes more to get rid of the worst evils. And my argument against that would be simply, if God intervened more, why for you and not for him and her and him and her and him and all these people? Where would God stop until it's just simply a divine determinism? Right now we could say we know 15 cases of horrible sickness just among us. Why can't God get rid of them? Well, that would be reasonable for us in this class if God did by next week, but then you go out in the hall and you ask another 20 people, and there's another 20 cases of sickness and illness and anxiety, and God hasn't gotten rid of them. Like there'd never be enough if God started intervening, would be my guess.
Please join us for more episodes of Dr. Whitney's God and Evil series and other series that will be available on this channel. Dr. Whitney is an acknowledged international authority on the problem of evil, for which he has published dozens of important works. These include his book, Theodicy, The Problem of God and Evil, the only definitive annotated bibliography on the problem of evil, as well as his popular book, What Are They Saying About God and Evil, and dozens of other books, book chapters, journal articles, and book reviews. He has also published articles in the New Catholic Encyclopedia and in the forthcoming New Westminster Dictionary of Christian Theology. For more information and resources, please visit Dr. Whitney's website at drbarrywhitney.com and his Facebook page, Thinking About God with Dr. Barry Whitney. The God and Evil series was recorded in Dr. Whitney's university course on God and Evil. The lectures have been edited for a wider audience and enhanced by music composed by Dr. Whitney specifically for this series. This God and Evil series is the property of Dr. Whitney, 2016.